Hello and welcome back. This is Roger Royce, the host of the 10,000 Startups podcast, where each week we bring you original content on issues of interest to startup companies, primarily around legal issues. But this week we're going to take a little bit of a detour, not too far off, and we're going to talk about some of the ways that startup companies get in trouble, and it comes up in due diligence. Not only just out and out fraud, but things that they might do that are improper that they didn't think were proper because they're just a small startup company. But then it becomes a big problem when they do a financing or an acquisition. We have with us today as our guest Sherine Ebadi. She's the Managing Director, Forensic Investigations and Intelligence at Kroll. She is an Aspen Institute Fellow, and she was a special agent with the FBI as well as a senior special investigator. So she, I'm sure, has seen a lot. And Sherine's current position now is working on investigations, but also in due diligence. So she's looking for the stuff that you startup companies should be doing. So Sherine, thank you for being here today. This topic is long overdue, I think. Especially given what's going on in the news. And I'm not going to ask you to comment specifically on these cases, but just to kind of set the stage here, I just saw this week that the founder of Theranos was turned down by the court. She was asking for a reduction in her sentence. Her husband has started a new biotech company, so go figure. And he's raised quite a bit of money in it already. It's using AI for medical. It sounds actually really cool, to tell you the truth, but it was a surprising choice of industry, I'll say. We read, a year ago about the founder of FTX going to jail for what happened there. This is a little before that, the founder of a company called Nikola, which had a electric truck that actually didn't do what they said. That was the allegation. He was criminally convicted. And most recently, just last month, or actually end of March, this is the latest big one. I mean, you can't believe this still goes on after you read about this in the paper. The founder of Frank was convicted of defrauding JP Morgan by inflating the number of users that her company had. And she did that to get a $175 million acquisition deal. And then she got hired on by JP Morgan afterwards. And the prosecutors, they alleged she just fabricated the data. She made up email accounts that she didn't really have. So it looked like she had 4 million users when in reality she only had about 300,000. So I mean, she was just convicted. I don't believe she's been sentenced yet. But I look at this stuff and I only know about this what I read in the paper, so who knows what the extenuating circumstances are, but how does anyone believe they're going to get away with this kind of thing? That's my first question to you.
I mean, it's a fabulous question. I will tell you, with nearly 2 decades now of dealing with con artists and generally sort of the large scale con artists, I would say that it is ingrained in their DNA to have an abnormally high level of confidence in themselves. It's what makes them good at being con artists, but it's also what makes them susceptible to doing outlandish things that other people look at and say, how in the heck did you think you were going to get away with that? Because their level of confidence in themselves and their ability to either talk their way out of it or somehow scam their way out of it is unbelievably high. I mean, as an FBI agent, I was able to sort of use that as a weakness, even though it's probably a strength in most cases, because they're willing to talk to you and they're willing to tell you all of the things that they did because they think that they can talk their way out of it. But I think in all the cases that you just mentioned, I mean, there's an exorbitantly high level of confidence in themselves and their ability to get away with this. And I'll just go back for one step and say, it's not always at the onset are they setting out to commit fraud. If you study sort of, and which I have, I've done quite a bit of research on large scale commissions of fraud. And I would say that one of the really common indicators, like one of the common sort of things that happen is that they start out with this amazing, great idea, in which in all of these cases that you just mentioned, there was this amazing, great idea. And had they done it right, it would have been groundbreaking. And it was groundbreaking in many ways. And then there is sort of an existential setback that happens, and their response to that existential setback is generally what takes them down one path or another. One path being fraud, and the other path being, well, that got exploded or imploded, however you want to look at it, and now we start something new. And that really, there's this inflection point that happens, and people go one way or another. And in all cases that you just mentioned, I think that that's what happened, maybe with the exception of FTX, but we'll put that aside for a second.
Well, FDX is a good example because, I mean, clearly, I mean, he might have totally gotten away with this if the market hadn't crashed, right?
Right. Like every
And
good Ponzi.
yeah, they all thought that things were just going to go spectacularly well, and
Yep.
they bet everything on that. And then you get a little blip, and all of a sudden, it's the worst disaster you can imagine, right?
Just unravels.
Yeah, it unravels. And so you kind of wonder when I say, how did they think they're going to get away with it? As I was saying that, I was thinking, God, I wonder how many people have gotten away with it
How many get away with it?
because they
Yeah.
got lucky. But it's not a great strategy, is it? It's like what you were saying, how, the difference between a founder and a fraudster is probably not that great sometimes,
No,
but a company has to be careful not to believe their own PR or not to eat their own dog food, right? Because they might not be as great as they're telling their investors. Um,
that's right.
so let's talk a little bit more about what you do. So I know you get involved in when would a company have, I guess, an investigation? Because that's in your title. I guess that's the main thing you would do.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's generally a couple of triggers for that. One of them, when we're doing internal investigations, one of the primary triggers is either they've detected some kind of anomaly that might be an indicator of fraud or other misconduct. And the other is that there's a whistleblower, so some external force, whether it be a whistleblower or a regulator, the government, another company, right, that comes in and makes the accusation, and then they are responding to that. So those are really the two primary triggers. On occasion, we actually do proactive reviews. So we'll do like fraud risk reviews, we'll do controls and governance reviews. Those aren't so much investigations as they really are like, we're checking to make sure that you have the right controls in place to detect, prevent, and respond in case these things happen.
Yeah, that's the other thing. You kind of wonder how it could be that a company didn't see this coming, how this got passed. But FTX is a good
Very
example.
common.
Huh?
It's very common.
Very common. Okay. Well, I'm
Very,
not going to criticize FTX or its investors or its due diligence because, that's just Sunday morning quarterbacking. But you do look back on it and you say, aren't there controls just to stop this exact sort of thing?
I mean, there are, look, the examples that you gave, and take FTX if you will. I mean, the number of people that are in control of the information necessary are very limited in that case. I mean, essentially a couple people, right? So you're keeping that circle really small. And the amount of information that's available to your investors or to, other stakeholders is minimal. And there are a couple there when you look at the body of work, like do you take sort of more broadly all of these examples that you've given and ones in the past, there are a couple things that engender trust, by investors, by other stakeholders, by high-level employees, by even regulators in the government sometimes. And in each of the cases that you described, that level of trust was engendered. And it's usually by things like having social proof, right? So for example, they have people that surround them, whether they be on their board, whether they be founders, whether they be initial investors, whatever it might be, individuals who are highly trustworthy, who have great reputations, who are almost like just by their presence and their involvement are vouching for them in the market. And that gives the average investor, even institutional investors, some comfort. So if I'm an institutional investor and I see that another let's say well-known, highly regarded venture capital, private equity, hedge fund, you name it, has invested in this company, or that their board, sitting on their board, are a number of people that I think are wise, discerning, competent, I'm a whole lot less likely to dig really deeply, right? Because it's like an initial vouching that I accept and I trust more. And so when you look at the great frauds of history, you will see that that is a very common theme. They play off this social proof, and it means they answer less questions and they get way less scrutinized.
I think that's right. I mean, that's the Theranos story. I mean, look at
Yeah,
their board.
they're
You can
bored. Oh my
imagine.
goodness, right?
It turned out to be what we would charitably call a founder-friendly board, I guess. But I remember hearing there's a law professor at Stanford who's a corporate governance expert who was asked to be on the Theranos board. I mean, talk about social proof. And he gave a presentation where I recall him saying he had a list of 10 questions that he had to have answered before he'd get on the board. And he didn't go through two of them when he decided, no way am I getting on this board. So,
Roger, that's really rare. And I will tell you that highly educated, successful people are less likely to ask the questions they need to ask because some of the questions make you look stupid. And when
yeah.
they don't automatically give you an answer that makes sense, and sometimes you keep probing, especially if it's an industry that you're not a like domain expert in, you don't want to look dumb, right? So you take Theranos, for example. I mean, that's an industry that the board, most of them did not have specific domain expertise in that field, right? They may be otherwise really intelligent, really competent, really successful, wise individuals, but they probably weren't asking all of the detailed questions that you would ask if you were in fact an expert in that. And they probably weren't detecting some of the indicia of fraud or concern, like the red flags, because they don't even know what to look for because that's not an area where they're a domain expert. And that's a big deal, right? Because I don't want to look dumb. I don't want to ask 17 questions 14 times and still not understand what they're saying. And then I think I'm the stupid one, right? Because everybody else believes it. And so you actually find that really competent, successful people are less likely to ask the hard questions when it comes to industries they're not experts in.
Yeah, well, I'm a startup lawyer, so people lie to me every day. And I learned early on that, look, if I don't understand it, it's probably BS. And every so often people will say, oh, well, you just don't understand. You'll have to rely on me. And I say, no, 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 no. Say, if you can't explain it to me like you're talking to a small child so I can get it, I think it's probably BS.
That's right. That
Let me
is
kind of
right.
turn this back to sort of what more of our audience does. What kind of, I mean, and they're all going to be big, company, big splashy $1 billion companies someday. But for now, most of them are not.
Right.
What kind of things do you see people get in trouble over when you do your investigation or your due diligence investigations?
I think there are a few things, right? So the really most basic ones are the finances, right? And most startups, you have, a couple people that are doing everything, and you're doing things that maybe you don't necessarily have a lot of experience doing, right? So rarely do you see like a dedicated CFO or a controller. Rarely are they having audited financial statements unless it's a requirement, right? Rarely do they have someone that, and has, built out sort of strong controls, policies, procedures, like governance. I mean, these things don't really exist in earnest with startups, especially in the early stages. And so, and also you're running, generally your burn rate is so high compared to your revenue, right? So you're not so much paying attention to that. What you're concerned with is growing, 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 growing. And what happens is then once you grow, then your sort of financial governance is in its infancy. And now you're dealing with large amounts of money and maybe a lot more people, and you have investors, potentially even regulators, right? And so I find that that's generally where they get in trouble first and most commonly is their financial controls are not in place. So they're susceptible to things like, sort of insider misconduct, like people misusing company funds, whether it be directly embezzling or they're just misappropriating. They are probably more susceptible even to being victims of fraud, right? So like double invoicing, vendors who have conflicts of interest, individuals who are self-dealing from within the company, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Even like time and expense fraud, right? So kind of the more basic things. And then as they grow, these problems, like they probably didn't even notice, it doesn't even hit the radar. It's like such small potatoes. But as they grow, these problems become increasingly more difficult to handle and sometimes, voluminous, right? So the number becomes a lot more. And that's where I can see them getting in trouble. So I'm getting a handle on good financial governance earlier on, I think behooves any company. And also, I won't touch too much on the you need to make your balance sheet look good when you're looking for investors. So that brings up a lot of interesting creative financial reporting, that you're probably really familiar with. But all of these
Well,
things
on
are
that,
problematic as you grow, right?
right. I can see how that'd be a slippery slope once people start down it. But on that, let's suppose, because pretty much every deal I do, once we bring an institutional investor and we go get an audit,
Yeah.
or promise to get one soon, is that a guarantee?
Oh,
Is that a
absolutely not.
seal of approval? No.
Not even remotely. Yeah. I mean, not all auditors are equal and not all audits are equal. And, it depends on their access to information. It depends how financial reporting is being done. I mean, I have you can probably think of a million examples, even the ones you gave, where there were audited financials, and yet large scale fraud occurred, right?
Yeah.
So not to point fingers, but it absolutely is not a guarantee, not even close.
How common is it for a company to do the kind of diligence? You've convinced me that investors should be doing this with their companies because I think everybody thinks that, oh, we got an audit. That's our seal of approval.
Yeah.
So, how common is it for an investor to hire somebody like you or for the company to proactively bring you in and kind of go through everything and make sure they've got good internal controls?
I'm not sure it's how common. I think it depends on the deal size, the
Hmm.
industry, and the jurisdiction, right? Because your risks vary, right? If we're talking about, small deal size or moderate deal size for your company or, for whatever your private equity or whatever you are. And jurisdiction, let's say it's all domestic or it's in jurisdictions that are generally less susceptible to various types of corruption. And and let's say that the industry is a moderate industry. We're not talking like oil and gas or even like tech can be pretty high risk, right? So I think it depends. I would say that there is always a need for some amount of due diligence, but let's be honest, you're not going to spend 100 grand doing due diligence every single time you're considering a deal. That does not make sense. It's not in the business model. So I think that when the deal size becomes moderate to high for your company, and when the jurisdiction is multi-jurisdictional, and when the industry that you're investing in, especially if that industry is not one that you have specific expertise in, where your internal deal team is able to suss out stuff on their own, then you absolutely need to consider having an external firm like Kroll doing that due diligence and going in. And I would say separate and apart from that, like again, this is not always possible on the front end, or it's not, maybe not possible is not the right word, it's always possible. It's maybe just not feasible, right? Like it costs too much money, the risks are low, you're willing to take the risks, but there should always be, and I think from a lawyer standpoint, this is something you might agree with, but I'd be curious to hear. What I find is that investors often don't have recourse on the back end, right? They don't have something in their agreement, in their contract that allows them to later have like audit rights go in and look at the books and records even. I mean, I've literally seen deals, but they did not have the ability to do that. And then they started to sniff out some potential fraud and they had very limited recourse, right? So having at least some recourse on the back end, I think is pretty useful, even if not to get your money back, but at least to be able to figure out what's going on.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting thing because a lot of times the investor in a price round, they'll get a director, and directors have rights under statute that they can demand. So you'll see those statutory director requests from time to time once they start to suspect something's wrong.
Right.
And then there'll be an information, major investors will get information rights. But I mean, those are just reports, basically. And then you've got the statutory rights to go into demand documents, which Delaware has just limited. If you listen to our last podcast from 2 weeks ago, Delaware
Hmm.
has just limited those rights because small stockholders can drive you crazy with
Sure.
information requests. So there's a million ways that people can hide this. I hadn't heard what you were talking about, where they can actually go in and, that's an interesting idea to give an investor a right to do a more comprehensive investigation. The more interesting part about that is there's usually no remedy. Like in an acquisition agreement,
Hmm.
there's 10 pages of indemnification procedures and remedies, etc. If a rep is wrong. In an investment contract, it's a very simple indemnity with not a lot of direction. And the reason why is because hardly ever an investor's going to sue their company if it turns out that there was some, a rep was wrong, or even if there's fraud, because what's the point? There's no more money left.
Right.
And that's now that's not a strategy I think founders should rely on, because as we can see just by reading the papers, the authorities take a much different view of that. They do have remedies.
That's right.
Investors don't. So,
And
and
they can
plus,
pierce that corporate veil.
oh, for sure. And plus, once somebody does something like this, they're pretty much done. They're done. They're never going to raise money ever again. I don't think. Whether the company hires someone like you or not, anyone can go on Google and find this stuff. But that's my opinion anyway. Okay, is there anything else that, in closing, I know I've taken a lot of your time here, that you'd like to let our startup audience know about, again, investigations, due diligence, good corporate governance, how to stay out of trouble, or our investors as to how to make sure you don't invest in a fraudster instead of a founder?
I would say for your startups, right? When you get to that inflection point, like sometimes the fear of failure is so great that you choose the wrong path. Um, Failure is okay because you can come back from failure. What you can rarely come back from is fraud, right? Like if you've been convicted, or you even if there was no criminal procedures that happened, it's harder to come back from that than it is to come back from a failure. There are many examples of people that failed miserably many times and went on to be very successful founders of other companies. So choose the right path when you get to that inflection point, because it will very likely come. And then I would say for your investors, like your point that if you can't explain it to me in a way that I understand in a very short period of time, they need to start asking more questions or just walk away, because nothing is that complicated. And if you truly understand something, you should be able to explain it in a couple minutes maximum to anyone, and they should be able to understand it. So, I mean, that's a really big red flag. I've got a whole list of them, but that's a really good one.
Okay, so if people want to talk more with you or find out more, how do they reach you?
I mean, they can go on the Kroll website and search for me. They can look for me on LinkedIn. Honestly, you could probably even just Google Sherine Ebadi. I haven't tried that, but I'm sure it works. The internet is an amazing thing. And I'm sure it will take you to my email or phone number.
Okay, that's Kroll with a K, Kroll. And
That's
I'll
right.
drop your information into the show notes for people who are watching this on YouTube. I want to thank you for being here. This is Roger Royce with the 10,000 Startups podcast. We've been talking with Sherine Ebadi today about investigations, due diligence, and keeping companies out of trouble. So thanks for being here. We'll see you all next week.